welcome IES alumni and guests. We are so pleased to have so many of you with us today to hear from IES Vienna alumnus and Morehouse College Merrill Scholar, Jimmie Briggs, on a topic that is so timely and meaningful for our world today. The program will be recorded and shared with all IES alumni and friends. There will be time for Q&A after Jimmie's presentation, and my colleague Don will be queuing your questions in the chat area. I am first honored to introduce my IES colleague of 10 years and an IES Nagoya alumna, Gretchen Cook Anderson. Gretchen has expanded IES Abroad's initiative to diversify education abroad in spades, growing the number of diverse students going abroad on IES programs by 151%. Ethnically diverse students now make up 27% of the IES student body. Please join me in welcoming Gretchen Cook Anderson.
Did I unmute myself? There we go. Okay. Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Dawn, and Jennifer and Jimmie for joining us today. And I was excited to see so many familiar names on our list of participants today. So thank you so much for joining us. Here at IES Abroad, Study Abroad is our form of social justice. It's our platform for change. Even as we think about all the change that so many of us and our world is going through, I too get exhausted and worried and scared and there's so much going on. So I think that that's probably why so many of us have joined this event today and why we're so eager to hear from Jimmie Briggs. It is always a pleasure to introduce a fellow HBCU alum, and today is no exception. As a proud Spelman College alum, I am really excited to introduce one of my Morehouse College brothers. Jimmie Briggs is a 1989-90 alum of IES Abroad's Vienna program. He is also a proud member of the Morehouse College in 1991. Now a principal at the Skoll Foundation, Jimmie is a longtime documentary storyteller, writer, and advocate for racial and gender equity. He is a member of the New York City Gender Equity Commission. He was a co-founder and executive director emeritus of Man Up Campaign, a globally focused organization to activate youth to stop violence against women and girls. Author of Innocence Lost, When Child Soldiers Go to War, Briggs holds a Medal of Distinction from Barnard College in New York City, as well as a number of other honors and awards from esteemed institutions. He has served as an adjunct professor of investigative journalism at the New School for Social Research and was a George A. Miller visiting professor in the Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. Jimmie is based in New York City. We are grateful that Jimmie is here to help us find courage in a time of change. Jimmie, the floor is yours. Thank you again, my Morehouse brother.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see some faces familiar and new. I have to confess, Gretchen, whenever someone reads my biography, a version of it, I always feel overwhelmingly humbled, but also that somehow the bar has increased for me by what I'm going to say after the introduction. But I'm a little nervous, but which is not unusual for me in these moments, but it's just so honored and grateful to be a part of this conversation today and talk about a topic close to my heart, which is finding courage in the midst of social change. As you noted, Gretchen, I am an alum of Morehouse College, class of 91, Merrill Scholar, 1989 to 1990. That was the Merrill Scholarship which allowed me to attend IES Vienna during that time period. I was there for a full year, both terms, fall and spring semesters, and stayed a little bit extra to get as much as I could out of the experience over the summertime. And without exaggeration, that's one of the, aside from getting married and the birth of my daughters, my time in Vienna in that period especially was probably the most transformative period of my life. As some of you may recall, 1989 was really kind of a interesting year. A lot of social change was happening, a lot of unrest, disturbance, not unlike now globally. We were still in the midst the heights of the AIDS pandemic. We had seen Tiananmen Square happen in China that June. That October, not long after arriving in Vienna, I remember going to USIA's library in Vienna and reading American newspapers and watching cable news and watching the aftermath of the earthquake in San Francisco, which killed scores of people there. And I remember for me, that time period meant so much, even at the outset. It was the first time I'd ever been overseas. I got my first passport to go to Vienna. I've had 5 since then, but that was my first passport, which I still have in my mother's basement in Missouri. And it just somehow I knew that my life would be forever changed. I think one of the first things that I slowly realized in the days and weeks and months, those initial days and weeks and months after arriving in Vienna, being at IES there, meeting classmates from around the country, from across the United States, many from Minnesota, but from other parts of the country as well. I think the first realization I had, which allowed me to really embrace the opportunity and opportunity to broaden my perspective in the world, the opportunity to actually hear my true calling, and the opportunity to to find within myself a certain courage or an initiative to choose the path I chose after my time in Vienna. That initial realization, I think, that I felt in those first days, weeks, and months was my color. I think at that point in my life, I was especially being at HBCU, being at Morehouse and AUC, being at an institution like Morehouse, where conversations of race and identity and responsibility were really kind of drummed into us, throughout every day, daily, weekly, on weekends, was my Blackness. And I after a few weeks and months in Vienna, I reached a point where the strange thing happened, where I could look in the mirror some days and actually forget about my Blackness. And it may sound strange, but it was critical for me because I realized up to the point of going abroad, being in Europe specifically, being in Vienna, how much I carried that identity, and I didn't being in Vienna, I didn't forget my Blackness, but somehow there wasn't the weight of being Black. I didn't feel the burden of racism, systemic racism, white supremacy, being in Vienna at that time, and it was liberating. It allowed me over the course of the year, my time there with IES, to travel to Berlin when the wall came down and be there and borrow a hammer from a German standing next to me and take my piece of the wall. It allowed me to travel to what was then Czechoslovakia and be in Prague when the revolution unfolded. It allowed me to go to Romania when Nicolas Ceausescu was overthrown there. And it allowed me to be in Vienna, trying to immerse myself in language I'd never studied before, and connect with local people, local Viennese, but also Austrians and international travelers in that community. Up until that point, I had always, I think the narrative I created for myself from an early age was I was going to be a doctor. At Morehouse, I was a pre-med student. I studied philosophy. I didn't minor in biology, but I took a lot of biology classes, a lot of classes in the summertime, to bolster my credentials, to increase my level of preparation, anticipation of going to medical school, and going on to being a dreamed of trauma surgeon. I wanted to be working in a trauma surgery ward somewhere in the United States. But being in Vienna, I think was a transformative. It was also one of my first moments of true courage, because I understood then that my calling was not to be a doctor, but was to travel, to bear witness, to capture the voices and stories, experiences of people who may not have the toolkit I did, at that time, and I discovered that I had, which was being a writer, being a storyteller, being a messenger. And so after my time in Vienna, I went back home to Missouri and then to Morales for my last year of college. And, I remember, I was still writing friends and teachers whom I had met at IES Vienna. Sometimes when to visit them during breaks in school over holidays, about my intention to change my narrative, to change my path. And that was to change from being a doctor to becoming a writer and journalist. And I actually see one of the people who encouraged me to do that, John Stubbs, who's also an HBCU alum from Spelman, now based in Rwanda. She too had been a part of the IES program in Paris, and had, pushed me, encouraged me as a writer, as a storyteller to pursue that path. After college, after graduation, I remember vividly talking to my parents and telling them, I'm not going to medical school. My time in Vienna showed me my true calling, and I want to be a writer. I want to be a storyteller. I've had the opportunity in Austria in the IES program to find do something which made me passionate, which was to be there when history was unfolding, to be there and capture what was happening either in my journal at that time or in my very low quality black and white pictures on my film camera, or in letters and postcards to family and friends around the United States and around the world. And I remember vividly to this day, their initial reaction was not positive, I'll put it like that. In their perspective, one did not go to school for 4 years to become a writer, much less a journalist. But it was the path that had been revealed to me, being in Vienna, traveling throughout Europe as these momentous events were unfolding across Eastern Europe, especially in the fall of the Iron Curtain. After informing my parents that I was going to become a journalist, I remember, spent a few years working at different jobs, bartending, working at UPS, working as a waiter, before I finally had my break and moved to Washington, D.C., and truly embarked on the path of being a journalist. For most of my professional life, I have traveled the world, traveled across the United States, trying to capture the stories, the experiences with authenticity and sincerity of those who have historically been disenfranchised, been oppressed, been silenced, been made invisible. I credit that in large part to my time in Vienna and to the Merrill Scholarship and to IES for showing me kind of what was inside of me. I didn't know it was inside of me until I was away from my family and friends, until I was away from what I knew, until I was in a place that was unknown to me, until I was a stranger, really, in a different situation where I had to kind of, I had the opportunity to kind of recreate myself, to create a new identity for myself, and explore internally who I was. And talk today, today's focus of our conversation is about courage in times of social change and transformation. And as a journalist who's covered conflicts and crises around the world, I've seen the breadth of humanity, from the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, which I covered, to the aftermath of 9/11 as a New York City resident, and then going to Afghanistan after the invasion of Afghanistan by US forces and NATO forces, covering the war in Colombia at the height of the war there in the mid to late 1990s, traveling to Sri Lanka, writing about the war between Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan government, and the Tamil Tiger rebel group. And all these situations, with sincerity, with authenticity, I did lean back on my experiences, my initial experiences abroad in Vienna. Again, when I went there, I was very green, so to speak. I was not someone who, knew how to maneuver languages, not someone who knew how to troubleshoot situations and in real time promote solutions about my mobility, about my security, about my strategic plan for where I was going, how I was going to get there. I didn't know how to realize that. Being abroad in Vienna, being a part of the IES program, allowed me to learn that, allowed me to build that toolkit. One of the things that I think I learned in Vienna, I've learned since then about courage, is that, from my perspective, it really happens in two ways. One is, courage is something that we can muster as needed. We can dig it up within ourselves or marshal it to make a decision that may be challenging for us, to take an action which we don't want to do, to lead, whether in our family, in our workspaces, amongst our social group. But I also think there's another form of courage. And I think certain moments in time in our history, in our community, in our families, in our places of faith, we're called to be courageous. Certain times, certain periods demand that we step up in a way that we may not be comfortable with. Courage is not comfortable. It's not convenient. It's not smooth. It's awkward. It's has bad timing. It's disruptive to your life. It can be risky. I think, as someone who has documented, people representing courage, representing courageously in moments of stress and duress, as someone who, on a very personal level, has had to muster courage in the face of trauma, personal trauma, in the face of physical and medical emergencies. I can say that to deny the calling of courage, to turn away from it, to deny the opportunity to be courageous when one is needed to be so, I think comes at a cost. I think when we the moment we're in now, whether we're based in the States or globally, we're now in a period not unlike I think I saw and bore witness to an experience 31 years ago when I first went to Austria for IES. Then as now, we're faced with a global disease for which there is no immediate cure or vaccine. Then it was AIDS, now it's coronavirus, COVID-19. Then we were faced with social unrest, economic distress, global oppression and the resistance to it, both nationally and internationally. Now, the United States specifically, but globally, now we're having a national conversation in the United States, 400 plus years overdue, about race and racism, the legacy of enslavement of Africans, African descendant people. Several months ago, when George Floyd was murdered, and when Breonna Taylor was murdered, and Ahmaud Arbery was murdered, and their aftermath of their deaths, I was reflecting on courage. As I said before, I'm originally from Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, and I grew up not too far from Ferguson, Missouri. My mother taught there when I was a young person. As a journalist, I saw young people in Ferguson, in the surrounding communities, stand up probably for the first time in their lives, become socially conscious, become educated, become motivated to speak out, to share their traumas, to bear witness to what they experienced at that point in their lives. And I think then as in now, as in 1989 in Vienna, Austria, with IES, I think we're in a period now where all of us are being called to be courageous in different ways, to speak up about, the myths, misinformation, disinformation that we are being bombarded with on a daily basis, whether it's about coronavirus, whether it's about protests and race in America, whether it's about election interference. There are a host of issues, climate change, the climate crisis. There are a host of challenges facing all of us, no matter where we are in the world, that demand we take a stand, that demand we honor the responsibility that we have to those who come after us, the generations yet to be born. And I think that courage, as I said before, it's not convenient, it's not comfortable, but often it's necessary if as a global community, if as a country, the United States in this case, we are to move forward in a manner that not only leads to healing and resolution, but also leads to something better as a society and as individuals. Often later at the end of this talk, you'll see a video which I selected to be shown at the conclusion of it. But one of my muses, one of my inspirations as a writer, as a truth teller, was James Baldwin, and he's a writer who I also discovered while in Vienna. We never met in person, of course, but I remember my mother and grandmother sending me books to read when I would take trains traveling across Europe on holiday breaks or on school breaks or whenever I had the opportunity to go see friends or just go on my own to places just to see it, just to see these places, just to understand different cultures, different societies from what I experienced growing up in Missouri. And James Baldwin was someone I discovered through his writing while in Vienna, Austria. And he talked often about the light to which gives us inspiration, which gives us hope, which carries us through our faith forward. And I think now, in this moment of social unrest, heightened social unrest, for some of us, this is the most disruptive, disconnected period we've ever seen in our lives. For others, we've been here before. But in moments like this, James Baldwin talked about the need to hold the light, to protect it, and to hold the light for those who are here, for the young people, and for those who are not yet born. And I think, this moment of courage we're in now, this moment of social change and transformation, demands us to have courage not only for ourselves and for our communities, for our loved ones, for our friends, but also courage for those yet to be born and for the future we want to see realized. So, Rich, I'll stop there, and I know Dawn and I have a conversation to happen at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Jimmie, so much for sharing your experiences. And I think the words are profound and words that we all sort of, feel and just need to hear every once in a while. So I am going to open up sort of the Q&A to everyone now. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or type your name in the chat, and I'll sort of call on them in order, or I can unmute you and you can ask them yourself. While we wait for the questions to come in, I think something that I'm curious about in the midst of these conversations that we're having is sort of how we navigate this as parents. I know for me, it's been a challenging time, and I have a very young child, and I think that I did not imagine seeing this in my lifetime, let alone hers, and just how we find that courage, especially being parents, to navigate this time.
I think that's a great point, Don. I have two daughters now, very different ages, different points in their life journeys. I think, and I've learned this personally, but I've seen it in action. I think, as parents, and I don't know if this is courageous or not. I think it's just part of the job, frankly speaking. But I think we have to tell them the truth. I think that, the impulse is to protect them, to hide things from them, to kind of block or compartmentalize challenges that we as parents, we as communities, we as countries or states or cities may be facing. But in reality, for those, we can recall our own childhoods. Kids see everything, they hear everything. And I think, hiding conversations from them or just avoiding them doesn't really prepare them in the best possible way when they do have to, when the day comes, they have to confront those realities and challenge themselves. I'm not sure if that's courage. I just feel like it's a responsibility as a parent, as a caregiver. But I think now, when we're really bombarded by so many challenges at the same time, some more proximate than others, I think we have no choice but to talk candidly with age-appropriate language, of course, but talk candidly and transparently. The best way forward is always through. You can't, going around or taking alternative paths just delays inevitable.
It definitely does. Does anyone have any other questions? I'm sure I could sit here and talk to Jimmie all day, but I think he wants to talk to you all as well. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to just put your name in the chat. Looks like there's one that has come up. I will read this on behalf of Grace. She says, you describe sentiments about the weight of being Black feeling less heavy while abroad. And then something James Baldwin has expressed. Can you say more about why you think that is? She goes on to say, this is not Vienna, of course, but I'll let you finish that, and then I will do part 2 of that.
Yeah, I guess, and I guess in the back of my mind, I knew Baldwin had talked about it. I mean, Ralph Wilson talked about it, Richard Wright talked about it. Many non-white expats, particularly Black expats, Americans, have talked about, the freeing effect of being abroad, whether it's Vienna or somewhere else in the world. At that time, 31 years ago, when I got to Vienna, I didn't know that would be the case. I didn't know I would experience that. I didn't know I would feel that. and I guess when I talk about weight, I talk about the pernicious systemic reminders of my race, of my skin color. In Vienna, I was the other, but it was a different kind of other. You know, I was the non-Austrian, non-Viennese other. I wasn't the tall black male with a deep voice, whose physical proximity in itself was threatening. I wasn't followed around in stores. I wasn't harassed by police. I wasn't called the N-word. I wasn't, there's no palpable fear of me when I entered spaces. There was curiosity. There was interest to find out who I was and why I was in a certain place, certain spaces. But it was not threatening to me. It was not demeaning to my humanity. And I think for me, at that point in my life, as a 21-year-old African-American man, I needed that desperately. To be honest with you all, I think if I didn't have it at that point in my life, I might have turned towards bitterness. I might have turned towards inescapable anger or rage. I might have, felt a persistent animosity towards white people, frankly speaking. And being in Vienna at that point freed me of that. It showed me, it allowed me to not only express my full humanity as Jimmie Briggs, but also allowed me to be vulnerable and open myself up to experiencing the full humanity of others, regardless of their skin color, regardless of whatever language they spoke, regardless of their economic status. I imagine, and this is an answer to the question, further question, I imagine that many people do, many non-white people, non-white Americans do choose to live abroad for that reason, to unburden themselves of the weight. It's for me, when I talk to others about leaving, and actually one of my best friends last year made the choice to leave the country, leave the United States. Someone who's Brooklyn born and bred, very close friend of mine, decided to go back abroad and stay there indefinitely. For me personally, I've always said to myself, especially now at this point in my life as a middle-aged father, as much as I want to leave on some days, I can't. Not just because of the logistical challenges of that or familial obligations with a partner and two daughters, but having seen what I've seen in the world, having experienced what I experienced firsthand, like I said, I've experienced the wonder, the magic of the world. I've helped deliver 2 babies, not my own, in Africa. I've watched the sunrise in the Sahara. I've sat up all night talking with rebels in Sri Lanka about revolution, the Black Power movement, and I've had amazing experiences. Riding on horseback in Afghanistan. I just, all of that kind of brought me to this place, to this conversation here. In spite of all that, though, I feel a certain obligation as a messenger, as a writer, to stay here, even on the days I don't want to stay here and bear witness and use my gifts to push for transformation. As John Lewis, who we recently lost, tragically, unfortunately, John Lewis said, America can be redeemed. And so I just feel like, in my own small way, I need to stay here, as painful as it is, many days, and do what I can, do the work I do to help redeem America.
You did sort of answer the part 2 and 3 to the question. One thing that Grace did sort of ask, do you think that decision to leave sort of lacks the courage, from different Black Americans opposed to actually staying and, seeing this through?
I don't think the decision to leave or go, I think for me, at 21, never having left America before, receiving the honor of the Merrill Scholarship and going to Vienna for an academic year, I see that as a certain type of courage. For me at that point in my life, it took courage to do that, especially given where I was from and how I was raised and my view of the world. As an adult, though, it's less about courage. It's more about, what individuals need to survive, to thrive, to answer their calling, whether it's professional, personal, whatever. I don't see it as a matter of courage necessarily. I think we all have different roles to play in life. I think we all play those roles in different places around the world. So I would never say to an individual who leaves this country to unburden themselves of the quote unquote weight, I would never deem them less courageous, more courageous than anyone else.
Definitely. You also mentioned the need to protect the light of our children. Another one of these questions comes from one of our coworkers, but Ruby Bridges, another civil rights leader, believes that the change will come through our children. So how do you think we can best educate them, especially in this social media world that we're living in today?
I think, I think allowing them, as I said before, having the real talk conversations, the critical conversations is important. I also think, with certain parameters based on their age and capacity to do so, allow them to experience the world. And and as a journalist, and especially as one who lives in New York City for many years now, I encounter so many young people for whom the world is their block, or the world is their borough, or the world is their city. And it breaks my heart, it's not being a native New Yorker. I'm like, New York is so vast. There's so many museums, there's so many parks to explore, there's so many vantage points to just see the sunrise or sunset, or to feel the breeze. Allow your children to see the world, expand their worlds. I think that's probably one of them, regardless of economic status or geographic location. That's probably one of the best gifts we can give them, is to let them experience the world and guide them in that journey until they're able to do so themselves.
There's another question from Dana, and she asked, do you currently feel that weight of being Black as you did before going to Vienna? And what does that look like or feel like to you now?
I do not. That's a great question. I don't feel the weight of being Black as I did before going to Vienna. And now, it's not the weight of being Black, it's the weight of responsibility. And I would say responsibility and obligation, and also opportunity. I think, and I'm sure this happens at other college and universities, but I think this, I don't know if there's a specific HBCU experience, but I remember being at Morehouse in my case, it just being drummed into you that you always, as you move forward, you always look back. You're not moving forward for yourself, you're moving forward for those who come behind you. Whether it's other Black people, other Black men, whether it's your community, however you define that. Mine happens to be more than Black people, but you move forward, always looking back to make sure you bring everyone with you. And so that's the way I feel, to ensure that I'm always looking back. I'm not forgetting those who are behind me. I'm always, creating pathways and clearing the brush, so to speak, so that the journey is a little bit easier for those who follow. And I guess maybe this is a middle-aged thing. I'm always thinking about legacy, making sure that, what I leave behind, aside from my family, which is the most important legacy I have, that my work and that my presence in the world, leaves a footprint, which is inspiration or guidance to those who may want to follow my path and go further, or look at my path and choose to do something distinctly their own.
For you, I guess, what do you see the future of study abroad looking like post-COVID-19? Do you think those students who find the courage to do so afterwards will become better leaders and truth tellers in our society?
That's an interesting question. That's a great question, actually. I don't know, Joan. I guess I have a particular view on this, and maybe someone on our conversation today share this view. I'm not sure. Maybe others don't. But for me, I think the most courageous one can do, the most courageous actions one can take in regards to COVID is following public health guidelines to protect others from contracting COVID. and you know, if you can do that traveling abroad and still protect others and yourselves from transmission of the disease, then I think you should have the opportunity. I know right now it's challenging with certain borders closed and others open with high restrictions. But I just think that, you know, several years ago, just if I can share with you quickly, I wrote a piece, which I dug up recently. Someone reminded me of the piece. I'd forgotten about it, called "The Disease We Are," and I read it recently, and it reminds me so much of the one we're in now. But the disease we are, this piece I wrote was actually about Ebola, and talking about kind of the apathy or denial, or what Ebola revealed about us. And I think COVID-19 is doing the same thing. It's revealing certain truths about humanity, about certain nationalities, about certain genders, about individuals. And I think whether in terms in regards to Joan's question about students studying abroad, I hope that COVID-19 does not prohibit them, folks who want to pursue that path, the experience of doing so. It changed my life, and I know it's changed the lives of scores of other people who had the opportunity to study abroad, the gift of studying abroad. But I just hope that those who do choose that path are able to do so safely, again, for themselves, those they care about, their loved ones, and those around them whom they encounter.
Definitely. We have a question from Gretchen as well. She states, what, in your view, is the role of intercultural friendships and ties in forging ahead with courage in times of social change? Do you have examples in your own life of such ties that have aided you in living courageously in the past or present?
Great question, Gretchen. Of course, you had to bring the hardball question, but thank you for that. I think intercultural, interracial, interreligious, whatever category you want to highlight, friendship ties, alliances you're able to have, I think are especially critical in times like this. At the outset, especially this late spring and summer, as we've seen the ebb and flow of the Black Lives Matter movement and conversation in the United States, I, like many, have been buffeted by the storm, so to speak. And I remember I actually wrote a piece about it for Vanity Fair, but I think, my relationships with friends, colleagues, neighbors, allies of other ethnicities, races, ages, generations, religions, ethnicities, became more important to me, but also became tested. And I'm going to give you an example, Gretchen, a concrete example. In this article I wrote for Vanity Fair, it was really to an article to none specifically, but it was an article I wrote to my white friends who reached out and asked if I was okay. They asked if I was okay after George Floyd's murder in particular, and the protests that followed, just following his death in Minneapolis. And I think I wrote the piece as kind of a response to everyone collectively. And I said, no, I'm not okay. That was the title of the article, no, I'm not okay. And I wrote the article with some trepidation because I didn't want to hurt the friends and colleagues who reached out to me, texting and calling to ask if I was okay. But it was an inflection point. It was also an opportunity for them on insight into my journey, because in some cases I'd never spoken about my journey as a Black man in America. We'd skirted the issue of race somehow, even though it's one that close to my heart, especially racial justice. And it was an opportunity, one, for me to say to them, I'm not okay, but I haven't been okay since I was born. I was born traumatized. That was trauma is intergenerational. I inherited trauma. My parents and grandparents and great grandparents in Louisiana and Kentucky, like I've been traumatized my whole life. So no, I'm not okay. it opened a conversation for me to, one, kind of express, what I carry silently, sometimes not so silently other times, but it also opened up opportunity for me to say to them, are you okay? Because I guess, I imagine, George Floyd's murder in particular, and those eight plus minutes through which he died, his death unfolded, woke you up to what's been happening in this country for 400 plus years. So that must be very overwhelming. I'm sure you're not okay being awakened to the reality of this journey in America for those of us who are not white. And it was a beautiful conversation. Aside from the article, I was able to have conversations with a lot of my white friends and family members, in-laws, colleagues about race for the first time. And they grew and I grew and we grew closer in our relationships. And I think that was important, especially now, because now we can move forward in more of a shared journey rather than me walking a journey and them walking a journey, but on a very different path than me.
We have another question from Liz. She just sort of follows up with sort of Black Americans sort of migrating to Europe. Do you think with such an inflection of that, has there been a change in how Blacks are being viewed in Europe now opposed to when you studied abroad?
It's a lot of, I'm looking at all these questions now. A lot to get through. Actually, okay, let me speed up my responses here. To be honest with you, I don't know. Since I lived in Vienna for that year plus, through the opportunity afforded me by IES and the Merrill Scholarship, I go back so intermittently now, and not just because of COVID, but so much of my travel now is to South America or to Sub-Saharan Africa or to the Middle East or Asia. I just have not been to Europe as often. Just from my experience, I can say, I'm not sure if there's been a change, and there are others on this call. I know Janet for sure. There are others on this call who could speak to if the view of Blacks has changed or not. I guess, from what I've seen when I have gone to Europe and talked to colleagues who've traveled and worked there and lived there, I think, whether or not the view has changed, it depends on what type of Black person you are. By that I mean if you're Black American versus Black African, or Black South American, or a Black person from some other part of the world, it may be different for you. I imagine, I'm just guessing here, maybe Black Westerners are viewed in Canada or elsewhere in North America, are viewed more favorably than others. I'm not sure though.
Joanna asked, so you about talking about James Baldwin, if you had maybe any reading recommendations these days. They're all very much focused on, I guess, situations here in the US other than the recently released book Caste, she mentions. Do you have any recommendations for reading that puts the Black Lives Matter movement and questions of systemic racism in more of an international context?
That's a great question, Joanna. It's interesting, and just to speak candidly, I mean, there are books. I mean, Baldwin, his books among many others. I personally, I've been going back to reading and rereading non-white feminist writers: June Jordan, Audre Lorde, Nikki Giovanni. Queer writers, queer women writers of color. I've been focusing on their words and lessons. I guess in my heart, I not so secretly believe that at least when it comes to Black Americans, our collective liberation or emancipation, if you will, spiritually, if not physically, will happen through leadership of Black women, and queer Black women. So I've been kind of grounding myself in that. It's interesting to me, though, in the wake of, and we've all seen it, the surge and Black books and Black authors, the wake of the deaths we've seen most recently at the hands of law enforcement officers around the country. Aside from the Black female writers I've been reading, and this is gonna sound strange, I hope it doesn't offend anyone, but I've really kind of been doubling down my reading of whiteness. because I have to share with you, you know, it's painful for me. And some days the pain is, I can push it down. Some days the pain is like, you know, right in front of me. It's hard to work some days, but I just, you know, when I think about George Floyd, the documentation of his death by a Black teenager in Minneapolis, and when I think about Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and the gentleman, you know, who died last year, I forget his name now, but died last year in a Forsyth County, North Carolina jail, captured on video as well. I'm overcome with despair because I'm trying to understand, which is why I'm reading books like Jonathan Metzl's, geez, so I blanked the book. Jonathan Metzl's Dying of Whiteness, or I've not read the more popular book, White Fragility by Robert DiAngelo. Of course, you mentioned Cass by Isabel Wilkerson. There's a book called Healing from Hate by Eli Zaslow. I guess I'm trying to understand, those books I'm reading, I'm trying to understand, you know, why couldn't America see us? Why couldn't, after 40 years of trauma, lynchings, police shootings, some on video, some not, you know, after 40 years of you know, spiritual assault on Black people, why couldn't America see us until now? Why did it take so long? I guess I'm reading this book because I want to understand for myself so I can maintain my faith moving forward, actually. That I can maintain faith that what we're experiencing now is not just a moment, but actually is a movement for change. Right now, I'm not so sure, but I'm hoping if I can understand why America couldn't see Black pain or Native Indigenous pain, it'll better equip me to do the work of John Lewis and help redeem America.
The next question comes from Michael. And for this one, Michael, sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm going to unmute you and sort of let you, or you can unmute yourself and sort of ask this question. It seems pretty topical in this situation. I think you and Jimmie can have a nice conversation about this.
Yeah, well, thank you. Jimmie, I thank you again for just the courage of sharing what you shared. It actually is very courageous for us to hear that. So obviously, I never described it the way you described it, and I never thought about the way you described it. But my situation was the reverse. In other words, I was born and raised in Nigeria. I never thought of Blackness, never considered, never thought of the color of my skin, never occurred to me at all until I came to the US. Even as a PhD student, because my professors came from all over the world, I still did not feel that weight of Blackness until I became a professor. Then I began to feel this weight of Blackness, which I did not realize before. And so, but then as I walked through that myself and tried to understand where this is coming from, what the rationale was, I began to realize that it's something that a whole lot more people have been feeling for such a long time, but I just happened to begin to feel it at this stage in my life. And as I assumed more leadership role at Penn State, a different university, I began to feel that weight even more. I mean, you know, so not less, but more. Because then not only was I feeling the weight of being Black myself and the expectation that all eyes are on me just because I'm Black, I also felt the need, all eyes of other Black people on me, trying to make sure that I do well. It's just incredible. It's almost like carrying all this weight around without knowing you're carrying the weight. And of course, I think what that has done over the years is that I didn't even realize, but over time I felt that I became a more empathetic person. Not just towards a particular color, but it was anyone who is marginalized. For example, when I used to teach, there were very few female in my classes. I mean, you know, engineering, those female in those days. I remember we'll have a sea of heads who are just white males, and then maybe 2 or 3, you know, Black females. And all of a sudden, I began to be empathetic towards them, to begin to draw them out, because normally they would say nothing in the class. But then when the exam time came, they always came on top. And I was thinking, I asked questions, but they wouldn't say anything in class. Then I realized it's because they were feeling the weight of being female in the sea of white people. You know, and I was just wondering, of course, more of a comment, but I was wondering whether you felt that kind of weight, changing in the weight as you move towards your own professional career. Maybe more empathetic, I don't know, I'm just sharing mine with you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I so appreciate your vulnerability and sharing your journey. And I'm so honored that you shared it with me and with us in this conversation. I want to respond to your question. I want to first make sure I also, Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing about that my article was distributed at UCSF among the faculty. I didn't know that. So I'm honored by that. Thank you so much for informing me of that. And I also want to make sure I address Teto's question as well before we transition. In answer to your question, Michael, again, thank you so much for sharing. Every day that I wake up, I'm more empathetic. I mean, sometimes to a fault. Sometimes, to a physical fault. I think, my experience in Vienna, traveling throughout Eastern Europe as I included fellow, my experience in Vienna, meeting, bonding with, becoming friends with, becoming, classmates with, sharing something deeply personal at a vulnerable period of all of our lives with those who attended my class, 1989 to 1990 in Vienna, made me empathetic, opened my eyes, cracked open my heart in a profound, lasting way, which served me as a journalist. And as a journalist, Michael, empathy was my greatest skill. Sometimes it hobbled me because I felt too much what people around me were experiencing, especially the bad. But I've lived too long. I've seen too much. I've heard too many stories. Too many people love me. I love too many people not to be empathetic. I talk about whiteness and white supremacy and racism, and I love my white brothers and sisters, and I love my native brothers and sisters who I spent time with in Montana this last year and earlier this year, and I just I believe what Gandhi wrote and Thoreau and Martin Luther King, we're all connected. We're all sisters and brothers. I believe that in my heart. I know that race is a construct that one day will be disrupted, and that carries me through. Teta, I would say the advice I would give young people who are looking for a wider perspective, who may not be able to travel or study abroad. I think what saved me in so many ways was reading, as simple as reading, not watching TV. It was before social media. It was just the wonder and magic of literature, nonfiction and creative, poetry. And Janet knows that too, and then Krista knows that as well. It was venturing into neighborhoods, starting conversations with people with whom I seemingly had nothing in common, and finding common ground, common humanity. That opened my eyes. Those periods where whether it was in Missouri or New York or wherever I was living at a particular time, connecting with people outside of my own experience or understanding, cracked my heart up a little bit wider, and broadened my perspective on what's possible. It increased my imagination. And so I think, even if for whatever reason you can't study abroad, such as in the program IES offers, even if you're stationary physically, your mind can be totally free. Your spirit can be totally free in other ways.
Well, I think that was a great question, a great answer to end on. There is one more question. I think we'll take this from Sherry and then we'll wrap up.
That's a big question.
Hopefully we can wrap this up. She says, I wonder if she always feels more empathetic towards marginalized groups, especially being a white American, and she felt the weight of being judged as she was an American studying in England. I guess actually more of a comment more than a question, but just her weight of feeling as a white American studying in Europe, I think, opposed to the discrimination and the weight that we may feel as Black Americans studying in Europe. So I'm going to end it on that.
Thank you, Sherry.
And then Jody has a few words. And then Gretchen is going to sort of lead us out with a piece that Jimmie has picked to share with the group. So Jimmie, thank you again for being here today. It was great. I think everyone got a lot out of this conversation.
Thank you.
And we will be sharing it out with everyone soon. So I will give it to you, Jody.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you, Jimmie, so much for your comments, and thank you all for your questions and for your ears and for your empathy. I think we've really all grown today, and that's the purpose of this whole session. And I wanted to let you know that, you know, IES Abroad is committed to accessibility and bringing over students of every sort and every economic level, so that their worlds can be opened and so that they can be, as Jimmie said, cracked open. So if you would like to be a part of that, we would welcome you. We want everyone, once the world reopens, to be able to experience the joys and the discomfort of studying abroad. That's where growth is found. So thank you all again. And I'm going to give you back to Gretchen, and we have a great way to end our session today, and we are looking forward to you taking part in that. Thank you.
Thank you again, Jody. And I want to thank our entire IES Abroad advancement team for the work that they have done in putting this session together. And again, thanking Brother Jimmie. Thank you so much for your wonderful words and inspiration and your stories. I know that I certainly am taking something away from that, and I hope that others are too. I also want to thank some other folks whose faces I see on here today, my IES workplace family members who have joined us today, as well as fellow Spelman and Morehouse College alums. I see Krista Saunders, Jeanette Stubbs, John O. Hodges, and others who are with us today. And I like to put the O in John O. Hodges, that's very important. And so, who has helped us with our Charles E. Merrill Jr. Scholarship and getting that launched into the stratosphere. We thank you, John, for your efforts there. And I think if anyone wants to contribute to that scholarship, we are not going to stop you. So thank you very much for that. I hope, Jody, maybe we will put a link or something in the chat for anyone who would like to donate to the Charles E. Merrill Jr. brand new endowed scholarship that we have launched here at IES Abroad to help Morehouse and Spelman College students to study abroad and see the world. So what I just wanted to mention in just the beautiful aftermath of Jimmie's thoughts and stories, that and to paraphrase from his own words, that courage is not often comfortable, as he told us, right? And courage is called upon in times that are not always convenient for any of us, right? But yet we are called upon nevertheless, out of necessity, if we are to move forward to something better. So let us all move ahead collectively and individually with courage, optimism, steadfastness, real talk, as Jimmie mentioned to us, and authenticity. Jimmie, you also mentioned that you wrote a piece that was once called "The Disease is Us," correct? On the Ebola virus, I believe. And I'd also argue that the antidote is also us, and our courage, our empathy, and our humanity in these times of major social change around the world and in our country are the delivery method of that antidote. So speaking of our humanity, James Baldwin spoke with candor about the necessity of seeing the humanity in people who look like me, as well as all of us around the world, in 1969 on the Dick Cavett Show. Who remembers the Dick Cavett Show? I actually remember when I was little, right? In my case. But at any rate, whether you remember it from when it was first on the air or reruns, or you've never heard of it before, please take a look at this, some important words that James Baldwin shared with us now. And I would challenge you to reflect on how meaningful and how relevant they are even today in this year 2020. Thank you everyone for joining us. We wish you the best. Be well, please be well. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you again, Jimmie Briggs.
I was right. That's part of the dilemma of being an American Negro, that one is a little bit colored and a little bit white. And not only in physical terms, but in the head and in the heart. And there are days, this is one of them, when you wonder what your role is in this country and what your future is in it. How precisely you're going to reconcile yourself to your situation here, and how you're going to communicate to the vast, heedless, unthinking, cruel white majority that you are here. I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. I base this on their conduct, not on what they say. And this means that they have become, in themselves, moral monsters.
Well, Jim, I can see...
It's a terrible indictment.
Yes.
I mean every word I say. It was a great shock to me. I want to say this on the air. The Attorney General did not know.
You mean the Attorney General of the United States?
Mr. Robert Kennedy. Didn't know that I would have trouble convincing my nephew to go to Cuba, for example, to liberate the Cubans in defense of a government which now says it is doing everything it can do, which cannot liberate me. Now, there are 20 million people in this country, and you can't put them all in jail. I know how my nephew feels. I know how I feel. I know how the cats in the barbershop feel. A boy last week, who was 16 in San Francisco, told me on television, thank God we got him to talk, maybe somebody will start to listen. He said, I got no country, I've got no flag. Now, he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house because San Francisco is engaging, as all, most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. Now we're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or, some abstraction called the Negro problem. These Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says, don't feel they have any place here on the basis of the performance of the entire country.
So,
I don't think, put it as simply as I can, and without trying now to investigate whatever the motives of any given Muslim leader may be, it is the only movement in the country which we can call grassroots. I hate to say that, but it's true. Because it is only, when Malcolm talks, or one of the Muslim ministers talk, they articulate for all the Negro people who hear them, who listen to them, they articulate their suffering. The suffering which has been in this country so long denied. That's Malcolm's great authority over any of his audiences. He corroborates their reality. He tells them that they really exist,
Jim, do you think that this is a more effective appeal than the appeal of Martin Luther King?
It's much more sinister because it is much more effective. It's much more effective because it is, after all, comparatively easy to invest a population with a false morale by giving them a false sense of superiority. and it will always break down in a crisis. It's the history of Europe, simply. It's one of the reasons we're in this terrible place. It's one of the reasons that we have 5 cops standing on a black woman's neck in Birmingham. Because at some point they were taught and they believed that they were better than other people because they were white. It leads to a moral bankruptcy. It is inevitable. It cannot but lead there. But my point here is that the country is for the first time worried about the Muslim movement. It shouldn't be worried about the Muslim movement. That's not the problem. The problem is to eliminate the conditions which breed the Muslim movement.
I'm asking